Awesome. Awesome. And I appreciate you, Matt. And oh, I just filed to run again. So just adding pressure to pressure.
Hey, no, thank God you're doing it, Josh. I'm like the state of local politics in North Carolina is
It's the
dreadful.
only it's the only way we can get anybody into office that cares about people at any level is nonpartisan races, it seems.
I mean, it is. I mean, the state races are, and the money involved is just insane. Like I'm up here in Wake Forest, and it's like, gosh, it's not even truly competitive, but they're still putting millions of dollars into state house and state senate races up here, and it's
Yeah.
not even really competitive.
Yeah, for a $14,000 a year job.
Yeah, I
But
know. Well, that's a whole other aspect of it too, right? Yeah. Way to make sure you keep anyone out who actually has to work for a living.
yeah,
Because
it's easy to do.
they're there like 200 days a year, 250 days a year. Uh,
Yeah. Okay, well, let's try to get this going. Hey everybody. My name is Josh Bradley. I am the interim convener of the Anti-War, Anti-Imperialism Working Group of the Socialist Party USA. We are very, very fortunate to have Matthew Hoh here, who's going to speak to us from his experience in the State Department. And it's so rare that you find people that do something as moral as he did when he resigned under the Obama State Department, and is willing to speak out. I'm not saying that there aren't a whole lot there might not be people in the government that stand on moral principles, but most of them aren't talking about it. So fortunately, we have Matthew here. He ran the um, Ridnour Truth 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 Telling Prize in 2011. Is that correct?
I think it was 2010. I think it
2010.
was 2010.
It
Yeah,
was
but
it was the year after.
it was a while ago. Hey, look, I like quoting things, and that was 14 years ago, man. And Babe Ruth supposedly said, "Yesterday's home runs don't win today's ball games."
Yeah,
So, like, I mean, hey, but I appreciate you bringing it up, though.
yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and if and he would and we in North Carolina were fortunate enough to have him run for Senate, the only Senate candidate that really cared about the people of North Carolina. Um, so so it was awesome, and thank you for doing that. It's always good to know that we have a person of people that is trying to represent the people. Um, but anyway, if anybody is interested in joining the working group, if you're a member of the Socialist Party, we meet every other Monday via Zoom at 8:30 Eastern Daylight Time. And just get in touch with us. But anyway, I'm going to introduce or hand it over to Matthew Hoh. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Josh. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I just said it a couple minutes ago. I'm very happy to say it again. I appreciate that we have a socialist party, and I really am filled with gratitude, and I mean that we have folks who run for office as socialists, who organize as socialists, who keep that banner. Because I mean, I was born in 1973, so I was a child of the Cold War. Like a lot of folks, right? And socialism was like a bad word. It was heretical. It was, if you say socialist, it was like you were summoning Lucifer. I mean, so the fact that we have a party, you all have a party, you organize, you run candidates, you maintain that banner, and we've seen such a shift, as you all know firsthand, in the last 10, 15 years, even less, in terms of public acceptance of socialism, and most especially younger generations. So it is, quote, I'll throw another quote out there, right? Rosa Luxemburg, right? The choice is socialism or barbarism. And I think we see that. And that certainly is something that when you look at the genocide that's occurring now in Gaza against the Palestinians. If you look at the 75 plus years of occupation, it's actually longer than that, right? I mean, the 100-year plus war on the Palestinians, essentially. You pull it apart and you examine it, and you could see the structure of Israel as a capitalist outpost in the Middle East. I mean, certainly, if you understand why the British took Palestine following the First World War, and with their Governor General of Jerusalem said in the 1930s that our purpose here is to establish a loyal Jewish Ulster in the in a potentially hostile sea of Arabs. And what was that purpose? Why did you need that loyal Jewish Ulster there? Well, you needed it for reasons of commerce, essentially, particularly at that point. Go back and look at the oil production that was beginning then, the changing world, as well as to the dynamics of power. But we want to talk tonight about the United States going forward. And I had some remarks, and I'll truncate them because it's probably much better for us to talk and answer questions. But this idea of course, I'm not going to focus much directly on the Palestinians. Recognizing it's occurring, this absolute moral horror. Every day. I mean, for 9 months now, we've all been seeing videos, seeing photos that we wished we had never seen, right? We wished we'd never seen these photos, never seen these videos, and then it happens again. And I mean, what's occurring there, this genocide that is fully supported by the United States, in terms of what happens in regards to the U.S. going forward, there's not much of a change, unfortunately. I don't think that we're going to see a change in U.S. government policy towards Israel at any point during this generation. What I think we will see, though, is a further isolation of the United States. So the decline of the American empire will be further hastened by their full-fledged support of Israel, because in a host of different ways, diplomatic, political, on media, for media reasons, military, economic and trade concerns, the U.S. is isolating itself. Eventually, what you could see is essentially a fortress Israel that survives in the Middle East, backed solely by the Americans. I mean, if you even look at it right now in terms of arms, weapons, munitions going to Israel, there's really only two suppliers of weapons and munitions to Israel: the United States, which provides almost 70% of Israel's weapons, and Germany, which provides a little less than 30%. And you could see a possibility where Germany, as well as other states, limit their direct support of Israel as a consequence of this genocide. We don't see that here until we have a fundamental destruction of our political system. I mean, removing this political system of legalized bribery. Israel lobby will capture American foreign policy as necessary to promote Israel first policy in American foreign policy, just as the banks, the pharmaceutical companies, big agriculture capture their spears, capture their interests, capture their policies and whatnot, because again, we have a system of legalized bribery. So until we overturn that, until we overthrow that, I just don't see how you have a change in Israeli policy with regards to the American government, even though it is at America's own detriment, even though it's at the United States' own detriment. Again, this increasing isolation. I think what that does, though, too, is that it opens up possibilities. And I hate saying that, this idea of opportunity or possibility, as we understand what's occurring to the Palestinians in Gaza, also to the West Bank, East Jerusalem. Things could get worse for the Palestinians well before they get better. They may never get better. One of the things I've heard now twice is that Miriam Adelson, who is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, who provided a ton of money to the Trump campaign in 2016 and 2020. He is credited, if people remember, back in 2015, Trump would say things about how the United States needs to be more neutral towards Israel and Palestine. And then once he became the nominee and the Israel lobby money got involved in the campaign, he completely flipped on that. I have now seen reports that Miriam Adelson is saying she will provide $100 million to the Trump campaign, whether that's, I mean, I'm sure that will get filtered down throughout the GOP, and that the price for that, the cost for that, the ask, if you will, is the Trump administration allowing the annexation of the West Bank and presumably East Jerusalem as well. I've seen that now twice, and so from fairly reliable people too. From so you have this idea that it might well get worse. Again, we look and we say, how could it get worse? But it might well get worse. But the opportunities that are available in the United States to bring more people into independent politics, to bring more people into leftist politics as a result of witnessing this genocide and witnessing the United States' prime role in it. Because this is certainly a genocide that could not occur without the direct American support across all types of lines of operation. Again, diplomatic, political, media, economic, military, intelligence, etc. So are there opportunities then for us to, as we move forward, to utilize this example? We've seen it in many ways in this campaign, say that the uncommitted vote that occurred across the country. Here in North Carolina, I think about 12% turned out as uncommitted and voted in the Democratic primary. I think that was a number. So, I mean, is there a way then to utilize that to create greater political action on the left in order to pursue a furthering of our political ambitions here? I had notes on what I wanted to say as well about what this means for the region, what the Arab states, what this means for the Arab states, what this means for the world. Certainly, if the United States is being isolated, if it's going to be Fortress Israel and the U.S. against the world, well, what does that mean for international institutions? What does that mean for international trade? Certainly, we think automatically then of, say, the BRICS consortium, right? I mean, we think about all types of ways that people are desperate to get away from the American empire. And now they are creating alternatives to do that. They have been creating alternatives, but now that the desire to get away from the American empire, from getting out from underneath it, has reached, a critical velocity. So, there's a lot we could talk about, going forward, what this means for Europe. I spoke briefly about Germany, but if you tie in Europe's continuation with the United States, with some notable exceptions, Spain, Ireland, etc. If you continue that in with the reality Europe is facing as a collection of nations that, best case, they are all vying to be first among the vassals of the American empire. We've seen that, I think, in the elections of this year throughout Europe. A dissatisfaction with that. This ties into Ukraine. This ties into the economy. Spending in NATO has increased 25% in the last 3 years. So as Europeans are losing vital services, as their economies stagnate, as their populations decline, then they're spending this money on the weaponry. They're taking part in, whether it's a proxy war in Ukraine or this genocide in Gaza. You can see how space develops in Europe, really starts to develop, to splinter not all of Europe, but many, maybe some, maybe many parts of Europe away from the American empire. So I think with the horror of what we're seeing in Gaza, we also have to understand, what can this mean going forward, developments that change the world order, essentially, because of the United States' ironclad commitment, as they say all throughout Washington, D.C., towards Israel. And I'll leave it there because I could keep rambling and ranting all night long.
That wouldn't necessarily be bad. A question for you, in regards to the State Department and like U.S. policy, how informed, how much is U.S. policy towards Israel, or just towards imperialism, is driven directly by the defense contractors, and how much of it is, I mean, are there people that think, are there high officials that think there is a moral obligation to continuing and enabling this genocide? Like Biden after, I think he was somewhat affected by the, at least very, for a very small amount of time, by the the non-committed votes, right? I
Yeah.
think he didn't do anything, but he started taking a softer line without actually changing a whole lot.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there is there is it, regardless of which party is in power, the U.S. military is going to continue on the course that it's set. I mean, how much does it matter which capitalist party is in power based on how, how, um, let me think of a way to do it. I mean, is the U.S. military beholden to the political parties by and large, or is it more beholden to the defense contractors? I guess that's my question.
They're all separate entities within the empire, right? So they all are elites in the sense of that they are the governing or controlling forces that dictate the empire. You also have this really amorphous understanding, right? That there's inertia involved. This is not day one. I heard someone making fun of our vice president. I guess she likes to say it's not like you fell out of a coconut tree, which is actually kind of funny. But like this idea of that, like it's not day zero or day one. We have been 250 years of American empire, preceded by essentially a colonial empire under the aegis of the British Empire. There has been institutional inertia that has formed its own momentum. So it creates its own reality. So what you have is you have generals who will never be at the top of the Pentagon. You have politicians who would never be in the House of Representatives, the Senate, the White House. You have men and women all throughout the executive who would never be there, the State Department, the CIA, et cetera, if they did not fulfill the criteria of the institutional inertia of the American empire. So no one is going to be in these seats of power who the empire doesn't select, as part of its own cycle, as part of its own momentum, and part of its own being. And so you kind of get in a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing as you try and peel this away. Certainly, with regards to how important the defense industry, the weapons industry is to determining policy, absolutely. One of the things, I mean, people are familiar with the fact that the weapons makers put jobs in every congressional district, and they put money into campaigns. And if you're a politician and you're going to run against, shutting down the F-35 fighter plane, for example, you're going to get hit for one, not being patriotic, not wanting to support the troops, for being, an apologist for our enemies, but then also too with the idea that you are canceling jobs in your district, right? I mean, so they're very adept at understanding the political circumstances, the political reality of our system. You also have too is, again, on this institutional level. If you go into the White House and National Security Council, the old executive building, the Pentagon, the CIA, State Department, the people that are in those jobs, that are the mid and senior level people, the people who are doing the day-to-day work, they are all more or less endorsed by the weapons industry. They wouldn't be there otherwise. You may have cases where you have one or two members of Congress who have some heretical staff members, right? So you may have, if you run across, when I worked on the Hill quite a bit, Tulsi Gabbard actually had a terrific staff, and she had folks who were contra to the establishment, who were contra to the empire in there. But for the most part, the other 435 members of the House, I would say 400 of them, they're folks that they have working on foreign affairs, that they have working on intelligence, that they have working on the military. These are all folks who came out of the military-industrial complex milieu of Washington, D.C. So the people who are there in Washington, D.C., working in the think tanks, working at the institutions, the people in academia, people actually at the weapons companies themselves, they rotate into these positions and they rotate out. So you see this revolving door that often gets highlighted for, say, the generals and the admirals, but has a very real impact as well on the day-to-day workers, on the people, the middle and senior level office types. So what that means is that the people who are writing up the legislation, the people who are preparing the briefings, the people who are putting down the appropriations, writing the right, are people who have essentially been cleared by the military-industrial complex, because they wouldn't be there otherwise. There's no way for them to exist in DC because the military-industrial complex owns everything. I mean, you essentially have a handful of think tanks that are not funded by the military-industrial complex. All of the universities, not just in Washington, D.C., but more or less across the United States, have connections to the military-industrial complex. I mean, like, where are these people going to come from to fill out the ranks of the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, where they're not coming from a military-industrial complex friendly institution? And I think you have the same issues with Wall Street. You have the same issues with healthcare, right? I mean, because again, you have this capture through legalized bribery of our system, and it's been going on for decades, for centuries, I guess, right? I mean, so I hope that helps. But they also do. You don't want to ever forget that there are true believers. That the reason why those people have those, it's not like they get there and they're independent thinkers and then they get conditioned and they get put like in a clockwork type orange situation, right? And they're made to become true believers of American exceptionalism and empire. What you have is you have people who already believe that, who are already predisposed to believe that. And then what you then have is with that, because this is all that's there, because you're in this bubble, because the foreign policy is called the blob, because you're part of the blob, there is no other alternative views being expressed, or they've been minimized, they've been disenfranchised, they've been so disregarded that they seem fringe. So they're called my time in Washington, D.C., the number of times I was called not serious because I advocated for negotiations or whatnot. I mean, probably the word probably not serious is probably the pejorative I heard most about me in my time, doing think tank stuff and things like that. I mean, when Joe Biden says he's the most pro-Israel person in Washington, D.C., I believe that. And he does what he does based upon his beliefs. He believes in America, an Israel first policy for America. He believes in all of the narrative and all the messaging and all the propaganda. And the reason why that belief is sustained is because the foundations of that are all built upon the military-industrial complex and the larger empire, where any information he receives, everything he sees, the whole atmosphere around him, environment, will be one that only reinforces his understanding that an Israel first policy is the best thing for the United States.
Awesome. Or not awesome. It's awesome answer. Terrible situation. It looks like I've got a question here. I'm not 100% sure. I will read it. Patrick says, how would you handle the economic consequences of the U.S. pulling all support for Israel?
Do you mean?
I guess they mean that if we pull all our support from Israel, the economic consequences from doing that.
Well, I mean, certainly whether it's the economic consequences to our political system or the economic consequences to Israel. Israel is fully dependent, particularly now, on the United States economically. two of their ports, they've only got four ports, I believe. Two of their ports essentially aren't functioning. Their tourism has completely dried up. I saw a thing last week that estimates are 35,000 businesses have gone out of business in Israel, mostly small businesses. You've got in a population of what, 8 or 9 million Israelis. You've got over 200,000 who have been evacuated from their homes in the south and north of Israel. You have this mass call up of reservists, so you've pulled people out of the economy that way. You have a drying up of investment in Israel, as well as people saying, we're not going to do business with you anymore. We don't want to do business with you anymore. I mean, a consequence of this isolation, right? And a consequence of becoming Fortress Israel, but if you believe that God and the world's reserve currency are all you need to fulfill the ambitions of greater Israel, then so be it. So what you have now, though, is you have a circumstance where Israel's economy is really bleeding out. And if they lost American support, one of the things people may or may not know, Israel is I don't know if there's another nation that has this. I don't believe so. Israel has essentially full backing for its debt by the United States, so that any debt issued by Israel is backed by the Americans. I mean, essentially, it's the same as us having, being able to have Bill Gates or Elon Musk or someone, right, co-sign your mortgage. I mean, essentially, you can, so there is that type of fail-safe, that backstop for Israel that exists because the United States is there. And if that were to disappear, then of course you'd have this massive collapse of the Israeli economy, because there would be no guarantee, there would be no guarantor of Israel as you have in the United States now, which is just one more reason why the United States has such incredible leverage over Israel. But as we are seeing with Benjamin Netanyahu coming, next week to Washington, D.C., during our general election, in the midst of our conventions, the Prime Minister of Israel is coming to Congress. He's going to address a session of Congress, a joint session. They are going to stand up and cheer dozens and dozens of time. And all essentially, Bibi is doing this to make sure that people understand that Israel is in control, even though Israel is dependent on the United States for so many different reasons. It is essentially Israel that controls the United States because of their ability to utilize the United States' own political system against them. So Bibi is showing up to get Congress to kiss his ring in the midst of our presidential election. Who is the one person who can unite our Congress? It's not Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. It's Benjamin Netanyahu, right? Who is the one person who, not even unite, who's the one person who can get every member of Congress, or nearly every member of Congress, to take a knee for him, to kiss his ring? It's Benjamin Netanyahu. And that is essentially, I believe, why he's coming here. But certainly, I hope that answered the question about the economy. Israel's economy is in a very bad spot right now. And but without the backing of the United States, it'd be even worse, say, if you didn't have the United States Navy attempting to keep the Red Sea open, which they're failing miserably at, which should be a great thing to talk about with, in terms of our military, how we can't even assure sea access in the Red Sea at a cost of $1 billion every 3 or 4 months, essentially. We can't even do it. It shows just how much of a paper tiger the United States really, really might be.
Okay. And do you think there would be economic consequences for the United States if we pulled all support from Israel?
No, I think you'd have the opposite. Not I don't think there'd be much of a short-term change for the United States, but in the mid and the long term, what you would have if you had the United States remove itself from this support of Greater Israel, from the Zionist project, from the genocide, stopped its support, you would then pull back on and retard the momentum of the United States being isolated, right? So the danger economically of the United States is that if it stays coupled with Israel the way it does, if it keeps this ironclad support for Israel, that hastens people moving away from us. That causes people to say, we can't trust the Americans. They're dangerous. They're right. I mean, the impact it has on in foreign nations when they see John Kirby at the White House or Matt Miller at the State Department lie so easily so easily and enthusiastically on things that you should not be able to lie about. This is clear. I mean, the impact that has on foreign nations is dramatic because they know essentially that they cannot trust the United States. And most of these nations have known for a long time they can't trust the United States, right? What's the Kissinger quote? It's dangerous to be America's enemy, deadly to be its ally. And so if you were to decouple the United States from its from its ironclad commitment to Israel, if you were to have some truth about what's occurring there, you may then have nations that might say, okay, we're not in such a rush to get away from the Americans and their economic world order, right? We're not in a rush to build something anew. We're not in a rush to get into arrangements with other nations that we don't trust as much, or we don't trust very much either. But you know what? I guess I'll trust Brazil. I guess I'll trust Russia. I guess I'll trust Saudi Arabia, et cetera. I guess I'll trust them because I can't trust the United States.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I've got another quick question about Israel and Palestine. And it's from Wayne from North Carolina. And he says, do you think the decision to draft members of the Orthodox Jewish community will create a significant fracture in Israeli society?
Hey, and thanks, Wayne. I'm assuming it's Wayne Turner, who's running for governor here in North Carolina, the one sane choice we have in I mean, just God, we're not going to talk about that, right? Okay, but um, I think it might, Wayne. I mean, I don't know it that well to really give you a good prediction on it. But it's certainly, I believe and what we're talking about here is in Israel, the Orthodox Jews are exempt from serving in the military. And I believe they make up about 12% of the population or so. I think it's between 10 and 15% of the population. So it's fairly significant. And this has over decades been an issue. It's been a problem because they don't have to carry the weight that other Israelis have to do essentially. And it gets it, I think, into other issues within Israel itself, cultural issues. It gets into issues within Judaism between various groupings within Judaism. And so I think this idea that our boys have to go and fight in Gaza, our boys have to go and take part in this occupation in the West Bank, and girls as well, I should say. I shouldn't say boys. Our boys and girls have to go and do this, and they don't, is a major problem. And whether or not, and we'll see what happens, but the chief rabbi for the Orthodox sect has said they're not doing it. They're not going into the military. So this showdown between the religious and the secular, essentially, is something that will only compound the very great fractures and fissures that exist all throughout Israeli society. And I am not certain whether it will take anything away from the right in terms, because it will cause issues within the right, and whether that will weaken the right and allow centrists to come back to power. I don't know, but I think that's the fear that many in power in Israel have right now, is that will be a consequence of this. But certainly it is something very interesting to watch, and something that has been coming for a long time.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, and let me check the chat and see if any more questions. Okay, a quick question for you, to change the subject a little bit. What do you think, from your experience at the State Department, what the end game is in the whole Russia-Ukraine thing? You've got two right-wing governments that are beating up on each other. I mean, it's essentially a proxy war from what I can tell. They didn't go in with diplomacy at the beginning. And what other than getting us closer to nuclear war than we've been in a long time, what is the end game? What do you think? What do you think that the Defense Department, what do you think their end game is? I mean, now that apparently Ukraine is kind of in a bad way and we're throwing lots and lots of treasure at it, and we're pushing up the um uh like what we're throwing a lot of, and we're extending this war
Yeah.
for good or for ill without taking an ideological position, because personally, and I'm nobody, but I see it as two right-wing governments battling for something. Like the breakaway republics were being bombed by militias that were very right-wing.
Yeah.
You know, Russia
Yeah, I
invaded saying
think
they were going to denazify, and then Putin gave a long speech about how communism is bad at the same time, even though these two breakaway republics were calling themselves, you know, democratic socialist republics. So,
Yeah, I mean there is no good side in this. That's been my opinion. That certainly I criticize the our side, the U.S. side, the West, NATO much more heavily than I do the Russians because I'm American. I mean that's essentially. But my criticism for the Russians is long and deep as well. What did James Connolly say in 1914 with regard, the Irish socialist, the great Irish socialist, with regards to the Great War in Europe, neither king nor Kaiser. And I think that is the way to look at this, that neither side is worth supporting. I believe that this was a war long wanted by those in DC, by those in London, by those in Brussels, by those in Kiev, and by those in Moscow. I mean, that's not a monolith. Certainly, the Russians were provoked into this war, but they also made a choice to launch an invasion, which has, in my opinion, turned out to be a strategic error. They're stuck where they can't conquer all of Ukraine. They're up against the West that seems determined, at least its current governments, to continue funneling money into this proxy war because, hey, it's not our boys who are dying, it's the Ukrainians who are serving as pawns in this. I think ultimately what it comes back to is a war of commercial greed and megalomania. I think it was for control of trade, most dramatically, highlighted by fossil fuels, particularly liquid natural gas. When one of the things we have to recognize is that there have been the U.S. and the West have been successful. The U.S. has been. The U.S. is now the world's largest liquid natural gas exporter. We took over the Western European energy market because of this war, right? So there has been success for the U.S. in this war. The megalomania aspect of it, people who believe that, DC is populated by acolytes of Zbigniew Brzezinski, and they believe that the world is a chessboard and that it's like you and I playing a game of Risk. Whoever ends up with the most of the map in their color wins. And that's how they see this. You have those who are imbued with this idea of exceptionalism, as people who go back and they reference Francis Fukuyama's or Samuel Huntington's, Fukuyama's The End of History, or Huntington's The Clash of Civilization. When those books were written in the 90s, and if people aren't familiar with those, they were books that were written in the early 90s following the Cold War that attempted to explain the new reality of the world. Fukuyama basically saying that the liberal democracy, capitalism has won. We've reached the highest epoch. This is it, right? This is, as well as Huntington, the title basically explains itself, The Clash of Civilizations, right? I mean, so you have people who they were describing the mindset in Washington, D.C. at the time. And then, of course, people who came to age with that understanding under that tutelage of that leadership in the 90s. And so there is a belief system here as well that is just in full favor of this class of civilization. The fact that we do have to conquer the barbarians, or if we do not conquer them, we at least need to keep civilization safe from them. All right. I mean, so there are many different aspects that roll into all this. I think from what I hear from people in and out of DC, there's a lot of breath. The breath is being held right now. One, for reasons that the war continues to move along an escalatory trajectory that is incredibly dangerous, risks escalation outside of Ukraine, so the war expanding into other nations, as well as risks what we call vertical escalation, the war getting more explosive, right? So you climb that escalation ladder and bigger and stronger weapons, ultimately leading to nuclear weapons. Yeah. So, I mean, there's the breath being held for that. There is also, too, the breath being held for what happens after November. If Donald Trump wins, how sincere are these reports that he will end this war, that he will utilize the leverage the U.S. has to force negotiations? We'll see. I mean, if who knows if Nikki Haley and Tom Cotton and others are in his cabinet, I don't really see that happening. I mean, so JD Vance, I don't think I don't think just because Vance says he's against spending money on the war in Ukraine, he's only saying that because he doesn't think we should be spending money to kill Russians. He believes we should be spending money to kill Chinese. I mean, so, I think where we're at here is in a very dangerous place where the war continues to be escalated in a way that that could get us to the place that we all said we've never wanted to get to, right? And certainly this idea of even it's terrible to say this, but best case, of course, is negotiations, which really at this point there's not political space for that, unfortunately. So best case you're looking at is a status quo, a reduced conflict on the front lines, maybe, but that's best case you're looking at. Because even if you were to have the case where Ukraine collapses and that brings an effective end to the war, well, the Russians now have a conundrum of what do they do? Do they move west? And does that cause Poland and Romania, say, to move into Ukraine to form a buffer on their zones, on their borders? I mean, it causes certainly a refugee crisis. This is why I think the Russians are in the position they are in now, where they are. Some others are arguing for further escalation on the Russian side, but Russians are cognizant that if we're not careful here, we will have a Syria or an Afghanistan on our front door, right? That essentially what we do not want to see, worst case for us, or one of the worst case for us, is a deterioration, a collapse of Ukrainian government and Ukrainian economy, as well as a failure of the Ukrainian army that allows Ukraine to turn into a state controlled by various warlords. Again, something akin to, say, Syria or Afghanistan. That's not what they want. And this is why I say the Russians made a very serious error. I think they estimated that they'd be able to get the negotiations that began in early 22. They got that correct. They did not estimate that the Americans and the British would pull the Ukrainians out of those negotiations in April of 2022. And now, two and a half years later, here they are. If they move the further west they go into Ukraine, the more they move into essentially Ukrainian-speaking territory, the more they're now fighting a conventional frontline war and have a risk of insurgency behind them. If they maintain where they're at now, without knocking out the Ukrainian government, without knocking out the Ukrainian army, well, then they are just having to absorb casualties, absorb combat for as long as NATO continues this war. And for NATO, this war has been a godsend in many ways because this allows this gives NATO a purpose, right? So the Donbass becomes NATO's Jerusalem, right? We have to retake it. It gives it its meaning, gives it its purpose. So I mean, the outlook here is really bleak. Unless there is some type of political breakthrough, which we'll see. Everyone's all excited this week because Zelensky now says he's going to invite the Russians to another peace summit. Who knows? But hopefully this is the case of Zelensky seeing the writing on the wall of Zelensky saying, you know what, Trump is going to win. And Trump is serious about forcing my hand. So maybe it's best for me to try and get a deal now that I can negotiate on, as opposed to having to accept a deal in January that I can't negotiate on. Is that what's going on? I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. Uh, um, I've got one more question on Ukraine, and then I've got some questions about a clarification on the Israel one. But since we're on Ukraine now, I'll ask. This is a follow-up. This is from Wayne as well. That says, the Ukraine-Russia war seems to me to be a battle for control of Ukrainian wheat production, which is important in world food supplies and is extraordinarily profitable for Cargill and other such organizations. Do you think this was a part of U.S. calculations in pushing the war?
I have not seen anything directly about wheat production in terms of commentary coming out of the American government as to, certainly you don't see uh, the Machiavellian forces at work as you did with the energy industry, right? You didn't see the purposes clear in the sense of that we're going to drive Russia out of the Western European market and we're going to take it for ourselves. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to blow up their pipeline. I mean, so certainly it is the Ukrainian agriculture, particularly their wheat and their grains, is quite large. That has caused all kinds of problems in Europe, right? Because you had issues with that Ukrainian wheat and grains coming into Europe, not being able to be sold overseas, being brought into Europe and undercutting European farmers and causing all types of political problems in Europe. If people recall back maybe about 3-4 months ago, you had European farmers blocking the highways, and there were a host of reasons they were doing that. But one of it was that they were losing money because of Ukrainian grain. So I haven't seen anything where, like I said, the wheat was a force, a driving force behind American decision making in the way that, say, the energy was. But I think overall, if you go back to this idea that this is essentially about megalomania and commerce, certainly the size of Ukrainian wheat and grain and cereal production is massive. And that factors into the overall calculations of why it's important to have Ukraine in our trade sphere and not in the Russians, right? So I think there certainly is a case, and I'm glad Wayne that brought that up because I'm going to look further into that.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And then Doc says, going back to Israel, what is your source for the full backing of Israeli debt? When did that start? And is it a law or is it executive branch policy of some kind?
Oh, I have to look that up, and let me I'll get a source for you. It's certainly, up until the 73 war, the primary support for Israel from the U.S. is economic. And following 73, it becomes a primary support, becomes military. And I believe it is in the Nixon administration that you have this backing, though, this loan guarantee backing. But I'll find a source and send it to you. There was a lot of reporting on this, I guess, roughly 6 months ago, because Israeli credit was downgraded. They dropped to whatever they dropped to. I forget off the top of my head, AA plus or whatever it is. So they did drop. And now there's a lot where I discovered this. I learned this what was then in some of the economic discussions. But I'll find something for it to y'all.
Thanks. And Lizzie asks, do you have concerns about the increasing development of nuclear weapons?
Oh God, yeah, 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 yeah. Holy cow! Oh my gosh! Across a whole host of lines, I think in addition to the actual expenditure, the development of new weapons, the fielding of new weapons. We're replacing our entire triad, essentially new bombers, new ICBMs, eventually new submarines. Has been which is all concerning. Certainly, you've had developments within the U.S. modernization, improvements in our early warning detection systems, where we have a significantly better detection system than the Russians do, and more, and as well as the Chinese, to the point that they are at a disadvantage. Certainly, the pulling out of the ABM treaty. This is where this begins. 20 pulled out, what, 2001, so 23 years ago. All of that has built a belief in Washington, D.C., that nuclear weapons are usable, that you can fight and win a nuclear war. Whether it's on the mantra of escalate to de-escalate, or that we would be able to conduct strikes in such a way that would decapitate our adversaries. You've seen it in things too. I think that for me, one of the most dangerous developments was about 10 years ago. United States started putting what we called super fuses on their our missiles and our submarines. And up until that point, our submarine missiles weren't accurate enough to be first strike capable, right? What happens in the second term of Obama's administration, we put what they called them super fuses onto our submarine launched missiles. And now these weapons, which are right on the Russian coast, right on the Chinese coast, within, depends on the target, but 20 to 30 minutes tops, have first strike capability because they're much more accurate. And one of the things that when you understand how nuclear weapons work, you learn that accuracy matters a lot more than just explosive power. So that's why the United States really doesn't have, and I'm not sure what the Russians do either, but doesn't really even have nuclear weapons that measure in the megatons anymore. We have one bomb that still does, I think, but because it doesn't matter, a 300 kiloton or 150 kiloton warhead is, because it's more accurate, is a better weapon than a 1 megaton or a 2 megaton bomb. So you've had all these developments that have really put the Russians and the Chinese on a back foot in a very dangerous position. And then you've had other developments too. Certainly this idea that we have these missile systems in Romania and Poland is something that has been causing very real and sincere national security concerns for the Russians. You were able to launch a missile from Poland, Romania. We claim we don't have those missiles there, but that's, you could very easily put those missiles there. They're all fired from the same type of launcher, essentially, so it doesn't matter. And so you're talking about a nuclear warhead with a flight time of 8 to 10 minutes to Moscow. And then you just saw this week the United States saying we're going to put our new ground-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are nuclear capable, into Germany. Those weapons were already in Denmark. Some of the ground-launched Tomahawk missiles, we put them in the Philippines where they can reach China. So it's not so much. It is one thing, the technology involved here, that these weapons are much more capable. They're much more accurate. They can be used in a way that are, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they would have loved to have this ability. But it's also, too, it's the mindset that we can do this. We can use these things. These are usable nuclear weapons. And you could very easily see scenarios where the American president, not just an incredibly malleable and stupid president like Donald Trump, but any of them, could be convinced that we can utilize a nuclear weapon here, either to take out communications or a headquarters, to decapitate the enemy, or to cause the other side to cease in their escalation. And you could see that, say, with Ukraine. You can see that happening. Where you can make arguments where both sides, Russia or the U.S., would be in a position where they utilize nuclear weapons. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. Had plans to use nuclear weapons in the Cold War. I actually just had a conversation this week with people may know Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff. And he was telling me a story about how when the Tomahawk cruise missile first came out in the 80s, Admiral Crowe, who eventually became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was the head of Pacific Command. And so under the operational war plan with the Soviet Union at the time in the 80s, the Pacific Command was supposed to distract the Soviets from Europe. And Admiral Crowe wanted nuclear tomahawks because he realized that's what he needed to get the Soviets' attention. And so they never got them. Thankfully, President Reagan never authorized them to go to the Pacific. But the Pacific Command's plan of operations was, if war kicks off the Soviet Union, we're going to launch nuclear weapons into Siberia, essentially. It's called the Kamchatka Peninsula, right? Vladivostok, in order to distract the Soviets, make them pay attention to us here in the Pacific. I mean, so that was one American command that on its own had developed its own policy of utilizing nuclear weapons from the get-go. Right. I mean, so, and then there are certainly other stories like that, and the Soviets had theirs. You know, I mean, so this where we're coming from is a place where these weapons, of course, have been used, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but where they were envisioned to be used in the war plans. It was written there. And now we have a mindset that not only would they be utilized in a major war, a world war, but also too in limited capacities, limited abilities to achieve, operational ends, not even strategic ends. And that's a really scary thing, because that's the mindset of these people. They believe that usable nuclear weapons exist.
Wow. Okay, another question that's unrelated to this, and if I'm going way off topic, let me know.
Okay.
It seems to me that the U.S. homogeny hegemon U.S. empire, when they talk, and I'm thinking right now of Libya, and I'm thinking of North Korea, and I'm thinking of Iran, who when we say don't develop nuclear weapons, it would be bad, we'll put economic pressure on you, sanctions and this, that, and the other. But if you don't do that, you're fine, or it won't be as bad, to try to de-escalate, to prevent new countries from developing arms, like India and Pakistan are developing their nuclear arsenals as well. But when you have a country like Libya that was like, okay, we're going to stop our escalation, we'll shut down our nuclear program, and then we destroyed their country from the air, like, does that hurt de-escalation? Like, it seems to me that would be encourage people like North Korea and Iran to, like, we need to get these nukes quick, or else they're going to come in and just bomb us while we, that seems counter to some people in the U.S. government that says we need to de-escalate all the nuclear stuff. The political wing, the military probably has plans plenty, but
it's counter to logic and reason and good thinking. But there are two ways to look at it. You have the North Korea example, which, certainly the North Koreans, the idea being that we have these nuclear weapons because we've seen what happened to states that demilitarized. We saw what happened to Libya. You can make the argument about Saddam Hussein that we essentially knew he didn't have them to begin with. And we went along. It was one of our several lies that allowed us to invade, but we knew he really didn't have them. We knew he couldn't use anything like that. So, so you have the North Korean approach, which is like, we saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. We saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, and this is the only thing that's going to keep us safe. You all have said you want to remove us from power. You've said it clearly, and you've done it to plenty of people around the world. We trust what you're saying here, and this is why we have nuclear weapons. The other though, is the example is Iran, where Iran ends its nuclear weapons program 2003, 2004, I think, is when the U.S. intelligence community says that Iran ends its nuclear weapons program, and has never restarted it. They've got a civilian program. They have done things since the U.S. Pulled out of the nuclear deal that Obama signed with them, that Trump pulled out of. They have done things to, if they were to build a nuclear weapon, it would be easier for them to do so. But they're not building a nuclear weapon. They certainly don't have one. And I think that is because they take the other thing is that we don't want to give these people any reason to attack us. I mean, we're going on what? How long ago was it with Benjamin Netanyahu for the first time stood at the UN with that little placard with the bomb with the fuse that showed that Iran was 85% of the way to, building a nuclear weapon. I mean, I think that was like 1997 or 1998 or something like that. I mean, so they understand that the Israel and the US are looking for any reason to attack them. And so is that the reason why Iran has held off on getting a nuclear weapon? I mean, there's arguments made too that they do believe that it's un-Islamic. They do believe that nuclear weapons are forbidden and crimes against humanity, and they will not build one. But I mean, there are arguments to be made that way as well. But is that the tack that they take, that they realize that if we were to do this, we would only have a limited time before the West or the U.S. and Israel attacks us. And with that, and I guess maybe their estimation is that enough time for us to build the bomb? But so I think there's both approaches out there. And I mean, the key thing, the one thing that matters is the reason for both approaches, right? The one thing that really matters here, the thing that's true, is the fact that they're all threatened, that they have these policies of either avoiding nuclear weapons or getting nuclear weapons because they are threatened. And it's a very real threat. It's not an idle threat. That because they are outside of the American empire, they're not a part of the American empire, that they are in danger of being overthrown. And not just being overthrown, but being invaded and occupied, and their people immiserated, right? Their country destroyed, their populations killed en masse. That's a very real threat that these nations live under. And that threat is the American empire. And so trying to divine what they're doing, yeah, I mean, we could certainly do that. But the real thing, the only thing that matters, Josh, I got stuck on this. I learned this, when I first started speaking out against the wars and everything back in 2009, and I would because I've been in Iraq twice, and it wasn't until I went to Afghanistan that I had the courage to stop taking part. The the thing I get wrapped up on or get caught up on would people be like, oh, hey, tell me, what's the difference between the Iraq war and the Afghan war? And I would go down that path and, well, Afghanistan's this, Iraq is that, and this is that, and here's the recent history, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at some point, someone said it to me, there is no, I mean, that's all meaningless, because the only thing that matters is that the United States is occupying those countries. Everything else is just, it's details. It doesn't, the only thing that matters is that the U.S. is occupying those countries. That's the only thing that matters, because that's the constant thing. That's the most meaningful thing. And that's what's driving those wars in those countries. That's what's driving the resistance, giving purpose to the resistance. That's what's, creating the circumstances, the reality of everything. Everything else, if you want to discuss the differences and how Iraqis do this and Afghans do that, you can, but it's all meaningless, because the only thing that matters is the American occupation.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up to that. Do you think the U.S. will ever learn its lessons about arming hard right extremist factions in their proxy wars? Like I think about Afghanistan. Like the Afghan government asked the Soviets to come in, and the Soviets built universities and girls' schools and stuff like that. And so the United States decides to arm right-wing fundamentalists in their proxy war against worldwide communism or whatever they were scared of at the time.
Yeah.
But and so all this training that we provided for the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden and stuff would, when they turned it against the United States, and while that did wonders for the defense industry, I think it made the world less stable. Like we occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, right? And like are the Afghans any better off now than they were before we got there? You know?
It's well, it's blowback, it's essentially that. I think one of the things you have, the problems you have as the empire is that you are utilizing at necessity, historical necessity. This is what empires always do, because it does, I think, can be effective, is divide and conquer. And when you divide and conquer a population, you are doing one thing. You as the empire, as the occupier, you're relying upon those who are willing to collaborate with an occupying power. So right away, you're dealing with a corrupt element within the society, right? An element that sees some virtue in collaborating with an occupier as well as seeing opportunity in it. And that's why if you look at these American wars, those who we have worked with as an occupying power in nations where we haven't backed the insurgency, so say in Afghanistan, say in Iraq, have been incredibly corrupt, And as we try and build those militaries, what happens is those militaries just become businesses, essentially. This is the armed, this is the armed wing of the kleptocracy. In 2014, when Islamic State took Mosul and the Iraqi army crumbled, Patrick Coburn, the journalist, who one of the best journalists out there, particularly for those episodes, Coburn says, what did people expect? The Iraqi army was a business venture. It wasn't a military, and that's the same thing too with Afghanistan. And then what you have on the other side of that is the people who you are fighting, the insurgents, the resistance, they very often have to take help from wherever they can get. And so you see what happens in Iraq, say with the Sunni nationalists who are fighting us, which the Sunni nationalists, Iraqi young men fighting, their families supporting them, make up the 96-97% of the Sunni insurgency. They have to ally themselves, though, with forces like Al-Qaeda, with Wahhabist clerics, coming out of Saudi Arabia. That's where they can get their support from. So what you're also doing is you're pushing a people into a corner, and their resistance is going to then be predicated on finding support from anywhere. So you can see how that becomes more extreme. And then you have the other side of it, where, as you were describing, Josh, you have where the Americans use far-right reactionary elements, say in Afghanistan, say in Central America, to do our bidding. And that oftentimes, as we've seen, has become, that's the blowback, whether it's Afghanistan with, certainly Al-Qaeda. But then what you have happen, you have it to a degree in Iraq as well, where we put our money on the Shia government and we put our money on the Shia paramilitary forces that become death squads, essentially. And you have the civil war there and everything else, all caused by our invasion and occupation, of course. But what you have, though, is you're basically put in power, and this is where we're so incompetent, it's laughable. We put in power those who are beholden to Iran. So, we invade Iraq. One of the chief arguments for invading Iraq is that we are going to take Hussein out of power in order to strengthen the Saudis, as well as also strengthen Israel. And that will cause a big problem for Iran. And who do we put in power to replace Saddam Hussein in the Ba'ath Party? We literally, I saw these men. I knew who they were. I had it my first time in Iraq. I worked with Skiri, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. These are the people who have been living in Iran as exiles from Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. These were people who were working for the Iranians, essentially. We put them right in charge in Baghdad. So our incompetence is just amazing how we can master blowback, whether we're trying to use insurgent reactionary right-wing forces or actual government forces. One of the best examples then, of course, being we don't learn. I don't think there's a thought about learning. I don't really like that phrase because it implies that there's an intent to do something correctly or to to have some type of moral or intellectual honesty about anything. What I think has happens is the empire uses the tools it has, and there's also an arrogance that says, well, we have learned. That's what they'll say. We know better, right? We won't make the mistakes of our predecessors. So, oh yes, we made the mistakes in Afghanistan, we made mistakes in Iraq, but you know what? We're going to get it right in Syria right now. So what happens then in Syria, you know, in 2011, President Obama puts Operation Timber Sycamore into place, the largest CIA operation since the war in Afghanistan, to remove Bashar Assad and his people from power in Syria. And who are we going to use to do this? We are going to use reactionary, right-wing, religious insurgents, and essentially Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as well as Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, whatever their name was at that point. And, you know, I mean, what you have then is you have this idea in Washington, D.C., that we're going to take these jihadists, the very same people who had come to Iraq to fight us for the most part, as well as Iraqis who had become, primarily a lot of them were Iraqis, who have become embittered and have found a purpose in joining an organization like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, many of them met and formed in our prisons that we had in Iraq. We're going to use these people to take out the Assad government. And they're in the east of Syria, and we're going to, they're in east of Syria, and we're going to point them west, and they're going to march on Damascus, and they're going to, you know, and so on and forth. And no, don't worry about it. They're not going to turn around and go back into Iraq, again, where most of them came from, the literal line in the sand between Iraq and Syria. They're not going to cross that. And that's essentially what they did almost right away. You know, by 2013, many cities in the Euphrates and Tigris River Valley are under assault from what's now known as the Islamic State, you know, particularly in the Euphrates River Valley in Anbar. They're very successful, you know, a year and a half before they take Mosul. So, I mean, just the incompetence in this is startling. And I mean, I understand why people subscribe to, you know, various theories about it. I don't want to paint them as conspiracy theories, because there's a lot of truth. There's a lot of truth in them in Syria, and I can tell we have documents that were released that pertain to this. People have talked about this, not just nuts and bolt people, but John Kerry has said this. Joe Biden has said this. Barack Obama has said this about how we were through our allies, Turkey, Qatar, you know, in using these forces in an attempt to overthrow the government in Syria because we thought we could control them. And so there's not a question of learning lessons, because, you know, we've been done so many times. There's no attempt at learning. What it is this is the tools the empire has at its disposal, and this is what it continues to use. And yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable, but it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna throw it out and see if anybody has any questions that I might have stumbled around. I've got a couple more that I can ask, and if there's anything that you were going to talk about that I didn't touch on, feel free. But does anybody in the audience have any questions they want to ask? Let me look through the chat. Okay, well, if you do type them in, is there anything that you had planned on talking about that you haven't covered at all that you want to get into?
No, nothing that I won't keep everybody up past midnight yammering on about. But hang on, I did actually find a couple of sources for the U.S. loan guarantees. Here's a Times of Visit. I'll put it in the chat.
Awesome.
Times, and I just did a quick Google search, so it's not anything that I've really put much effort into, y'all. It's just you know, but it could be a starting point for people. That's an article from 2012. And then hang on, where are these?
Oh, yeah. And that sent it to the hosts and panelists. Uh, just a second. I think I can move it over.
Yeah, here's something. This is here's something from USAID from 1994, it looks like. So it goes back at least to the H.W. Bush administration. And I think off the top of my head, I want to say it goes back to like the 70s. And then I saw one other thing too, I'll throw in here. Hang on one second. Here we go. From the Jewish Virtual Library.
Okay.
U.S. foreign aid to Israel, loan guarantees for Israel. Okay, this looks like it probably have a. So it looks like it begins maybe at the. Okay, I'll let people go through it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, hopefully that helps. Yeah.
Thank you very, very, very much for that. And here's a philosophical question for you, I guess. Oh, do you think the U.S. was a better actor in the world before and during the Cold War than it was after the end of the Cold War? Do you think that the Cold War at all constrained U.S. actions, or do you think that it hasn't changed? We're just running roughshod on the world
I
since
mean,
I
I
mean,
think, yeah, I think for me, Josh, you know, the thing about it for me, I think, is that I was a freshman in college in 1991 when the Soviet flag came down to Kremlin, you know, December 91, the Soviet Union comes in. The Cold War is over, you know, so I was what, 18 years old at the time. And my whole adult life has been post-Cold War and the opportunities that were there, right? I mean, you could come up with this, you know, we can hit the pipe and talk about fantasy, right? And this idea then of what could have been. Imagine if the United States had tried to, and maybe this is not possible. Maybe this is not possible. So please don't jump all over me. But this idea of like maybe the United States could have attempted to be a beneficial empire, right? Or at least a benign empire, or at least as controlling the world's economy, and still at that point in the early 90s being at the apex of it, right? And we had just only 45 years previously restructured the entire world economy the way we wanted it to most benefit us. So we were still benefiting from it. Was there a possibility that the United States could have continued in that in a way where we didn't have to control everything, where we didn't get in such a unipolar fever, where you had to either be with us or you were against us, where we didn't just sally forth to be the empire that we know we always could have been? You know, was there an opportunity for that ever to happen? I don't know. I don't think it's in the nature of empires. I don't think it's in the nature of the United States. I don't think it's in the nature of capitalism, imperial. I mean, we were an empire before we were the United States, right? I mean, you go back to the founders of this country. You know, you go back to 1763, right? When the king says, "Hey, you can't go any farther west," right? And you have all these colonists who are looking west and they're saying, but there's all this land that we can take. All we got to do is kill the Native Americans and it's all ours and we'll be even wealthier than we are now. Right. I mean, so, you know, the roots of a revolution, many different reasons for it, but there is this idea of Western expansion being hampered by the crown. And I mean, right. I mean, so even before we were a nation, we had imperial ambitions. So I don't know if it was ever possible, but I think that's maybe why, because I have this desire, this thought of it, this what could have been, you know, and it's foolish, it's naive, it's romantic, right? But you know, maybe that's why I'm harsher on this era than I am on the previous era. Not to absolve the Cold War of its crimes. I mean, I think if you look at it's just, you know, just on paper, I think many more people were killed in the wars of the Cold War than were killed in the post Cold War wars. I mean, and that's kind of a you know, an argument that really doesn't make sense to have, right? Building a hierarchy of wars and their crimes. But I mean, tens and tens of millions of people were killed throughout the Cold War. And I mean, so it was awful. But I think because I'm taking part in this now, this is why I believe we're in a worse era now than we were when during the Cold War, when there was a bipolar split and you had non-aligned nations and things like that. Now it's just an empire attempting to suppress everything, whether it's just people in a developing country who want to be left alone, or a nation like China that is just simply trying to build a better country and sell a lot more things.
Awesome. How do you think the military, the U.S. military, in the long term will react to the dissolution of discourse in our country? Like, we've got a far right party and a center right party that agree on 99% of the stuff, but they're bringing it, they're at the point where they just don't talk anymore because of the 1% difference between them. And I think as a symptom of late stage capitalism and the fact that, there will be a time when the U.S., the divide between the haves, which are small, and the have-nots, which are very, very large and growing all the time, will cause instability. And we see that in our political system. We had somebody that, took a shot at Trump the other day, and but that it doesn't seem like, while I've always said that the two parties of, like you said, War and Wall Street, are two wings of the same turkey. There is a political divide, and if you talk to Republicans and talk to Democrats, the worst thing ever is somebody that has like a 3% difference in policy decisions. But I think that it's bound to cause more unrest, especially as more and more of the population gets to the point where it can't afford housing. People can't afford to feed their families without working like 3 jobs, and the fallout that comes from that. How do you think, does the Defense Department have plans in place for like the dissolution of, I don't want to say the dissolution of the United States, but the dissolution of the United States as we know it, to where we've got a point where we've got this farcical blue-red divide, even though, there's not a whole lot of substantial policy differences, I don't think, and I could be wrong because who am I? I'm just a guy in Raleigh, between the Democrats and Republicans, but it's already having a destabilizing effect on everything we do. Does the Defense Departments have plans for what happens if the Midwest just decides to peace out of the country, or
No,
if
I
there's
don't.
like serious, or if there is a serious societal collapse along the polarity, right?
Yeah. So the military does, if it has standing commands, right? In the sense that European Command, Pacific Command, now they call it Indo-Pacific. So like when I was in Okinawa with the Marines, we had Operation Plan 5027, which was for the war in Korea. So you had some idea of a starting point. But even with with like a war in Korea, it was only for 3 weeks or 30 days or something like that. It wasn't like a full-fledged plan like you would imagine, that, results in the capture of Pyongyang and the capitulation of the North Korean government. Only gets to a certain point, because the reality is that they're only going to plan so far forward. And for most things, there are no plans, right? So for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, It was a plan that they came up with. It wasn't like they had a plan on a shelf. There's binders with all the different countries on it. And you pull, and I can, I mean, you could see that with the post-war planning. There was no post-war planning. I remember exactly. I was in the Pentagon in 2003. I was in the Secretary of Navy's office, and I remember my buddy, who's actually going to, I'll tell another story about him in a second. Timmy and I, we walked out of the office to go get coffee, and they were remodeling the Pentagon at the time. And so we cut through the section that they were remodeling. And in one of the offices that had been vacated for the remodeling, on the door is a handwritten sign, Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. This were the guys that were supposed to go to Iraq and take over from the military and make sure Iraq was a prospering democratic capitalist paradise, right? And the invasion was March 20th. I bet that they opened this office on March 10th. You're right. I mean, so like there was no planning. They didn't have plans that they pull off a shelf. And my buddy Tim, years later, 10 years later, less than that, I guess, 8 years later, he's back in the Pentagon. He's working on a joint staff, and he works for Admiral Mullen, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And somebody comes in, maybe it was Admiral Mullen, and says, I've got to go to the White House in 3 hours. I need a plan of operation, a concept of operations for what we can do with Libya. And so then and there, Tim and two other guys in the office on a PowerPoint put together, 3 courses of action for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to present to the American president about what we could do militarily in Libya. Right? I mean, it wasn't like there was a binder on a shelf. We're like, okay, the Gambia, Ghana, I mean, like, oh, here's Libya. No, I mean, they literally made it up in a few hours. Then the Admiral Mullen went to the White House and said, Mr. President, this is what we can do in Libya. I mean, so that is the reality. I mean, look at the American pier off of Gaza. Like, what, right? I mean, like, that is the poster child of the United States military, the American military industrial complex. Look at all the weapon systems that don't work. I mean, you're telling me after $1 trillion and 20 some odd years of giving everything to the F-35 program, they still can't get that thing to fly? I mean, so like the incompetence, the lack of just wherewithal to get things done. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I think there's the appreciation for, look, the American way of warfare. The successful American wars where the American military has won. It has always been wars where we have been able to waste more than the other side, right? And that has been a sheer fight of resources. That has been certainly the case in Civil War, certainly the case in the First World War, the Second World War, right? In the First World War, we're going to send our fresh troops over there. The Germans are starving. They're starting to have riots, mutinies within their forces, send over fresh troops. I mean, World War II, of course, I mean, certainly, so that is the essence of American warfare, is to waste more than the other side. And yeah, I mean, so yeah, this idea that the American military has a plan, like operational plans for something that you were describing, John, I don't think so. Maybe they've got all their war colleges and they've got all their different little think tanks and things like that. And so I think, they may have people who talk about it from time to time, but I don't think there's anything substantial, anything that you would look at and say, oh, here's a plan, or they put some real thought into this.
That's okay. Sure. Let's see. We're approaching the 1.5 hour mark. So we should probably at least wind up the recording portion of this. I do have Doc is asking, what did you do in the Corps?
Oh, in the Marine Corps,
Also in the Corps.
I was a combat engineer officer.
Combat engineer officer.
Yeah.
And
I want to say, oh, and I see, okay, it looked like long. Okay, yeah, I'll go and I'll look for the information I found. The stuff I was referencing was stuff written in the last year. I think I sent you all stuff from, a while back. So let me find what I was referring to in terms of those loan guarantees.
Okay, and I think Stephanie has a quick question. Um, is it okay if I just bring her into the chat? So
Yeah, sure.
and um and then if Doc wants to come in too, since they're much more important to me. Um, let's see. Stephanie, I'm just gonna bring you in, and then Doc, if you want me to, I'll bring you in as well. And Stephanie, uh, um, okay, Steph. Oh, you declined to be promoted to. Okay, so I'll ask the question. I think she put it in the. No, she doesn't have her camera hooked up. Um, just wanted to see what you made of the GOP platform wanting a U.S. dome, like the Iron Dome, and how ridiculous would that be?
I didn't see that. So I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, are they talking about like having an Iron Dome all around our country, like on every, like we used to have in the Cold War? They used to have prior to the Cold War, you used to have batteries of artillery on the coastline, like that kind of thing. I guess they're talking about.
Yeah, I get it.
Really, it's I don't what are they planning to shoot down? I don't know. Who knows? I've got no idea what they're talking about. I don't know. I don't know. I imagine it's kind of. I'm afraid. What I'm afraid with the GOP is I'm afraid that they're going to get back into. We heard about it. It was about a year ago where they really were talking about using military against the Mexican cartels. Like I'm really worried that that's going to resurface again. I feel like we haven't heard that, and maybe they've been just focused on Israel and Palestine. But I'm afraid that that's going to come back up. That this idea that we have to send Delta and SEALs into Mexico, we have to send drones in, et cetera. We need to launch ATACMS missiles, against the Sinaloa cartel. I'm afraid that that's going to pop back up again in terms of what these people want to do.
Okay, and I'm gonna bring Doc in just for a second. Uh, Doc. Okay. And while we're waiting, I think I invited him. Promote to panelist. Oh, yeah, there he is. Okay, Bill, I see you. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Turn the video on as well. I'm sitting in my living room right now. Hey, Matt, good presentation. Thank you very much for making the presentation to the for the anti-war working group for the Socialist Party. I know that Josh worked really hard and several of people actually worked really hard. Susan worked really hard to get you on here, and so it was really a very good thing. And I know that people really benefit from talks like this. I was 0844, the Marine Corps.
I'm sorry, you're what?
0844 artillery fire controlman.
Oh, okay.
11th Marines, 20 Palm, California. So
okay. I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in 29 Palms.
I like the Palms. I went over to when you were talking about the stuff going on in Iraq and stuff like that. I went to Kuwait in '98, and we spent 3 weeks
there.
Is
that like Operation Desert Fox?
No, it was basically it was like a logistics exercise where they were pulling stuff off of ships from Diego Garcia, and the idea was to see how long it would take to get those things out into the field, get them firing, and then get them back onto the ship and get them back down to the logistics port. And 98, when I did the calculation based on, you know, what I was making and everybody else in the battery was making, we were also firing for tanks down there too. We had a tank battalion that we were shooting for, and we were an artillery battalion. Well, actually, an artillery battery was shooting for a battalion of tanks. I figured it cost over like $2 million for just those 3 weeks. We did 3 days of live fire in the desert, and we played a lot of football, but it was so hot that we had to stay inside inside our our GP tents for most of the day because it was like over 130 degrees. They weren't letting us even go outside in Kuwait. And so it was just miserable, and that was 98. And I was thinking at the time, I was like, why in the heck are we over here in Kuwait? Like, didn't we already fight this war? And then every time we would go out in the 29 Palms, you know, they said that place looked a lot like southern Iraq, like the landscape and everything. But it's very rocky, dry, desert, hot. And it was, every time we would fire, you know, they'd be like, okay, we're gonna, you know, register these targets, and it's gonna come up this pass here, and the Iraqi Republican Guard is coming up here, and I'll fire for the, you know, register rounds to prepare to destroy this column as they're coming up. And it was like simulated, of course. But I was thinking the whole time, I was like, why in the world are we like preparing to attack Iraqis? Is this just like they don't have the imagination to imagine someone else, you know, who could possibly be coming up here? And then it occurred to me, you know, this is right around when we were messing around in Bosnia and Kosovo was just starting and everything. It occurred to me that it wasn't that we were still fighting the last war, as we were preparing for the next one. Like in 98, they had already decided that Iraq 2 was going to happen. And it was just a matter of time. And of course, that was the Clinton administration, but they were just looking for some excuse to do that, you know, to get that started. And it really kind of freaked me out. And so that's one of the reasons why I didn't re-enlist, because I didn't really have any intention at all of going and fighting, going back to Kuwait in the first place. I didn't ever want to go back there, but I didn't want to go fight in Iraq at all. And I figured out I'm going to get out. I'm
well, you're a smarter man than I.
Do my 4 years and get out. Well, you know, interestingly enough, I got out June 4th, 1999. So my inactive reserve started then. And you know what happened 3 years and 10 months later, of course, started Iraq, you know, the Iraq War.
My first time in Iraq, 04 to 05, towards the end of that time there, I ran into a lot of, I was up with the Army actually, not with the Marines at that point, but the second time I went back, I was with the Marines. But I ran into a lot of guys who were pulled off of the inactive reserve.
Yeah.
And many of them didn't know they were eligible to be pulled off of it.
Right.
Yeah. You know, hey, man, I got out. And like, no, you didn't. You're still technically on the rolls, and you're going to Iraq.
Right.
And
no, absolutely. They sent me a letter in April of 2003. I had two months left on my contract, my inactive reserve, involuntarily extending me. They said you're extended indefinitely. Yeah. And so I was like, oh God. So you know, luckily I still was maintaining my uniforms like I knew I had to, but I figured if I got another letter from those guys, they were gonna have to deliver it to me in Cuba, because there'd be no way they'd get me to go back there. But you know, 6 months later I was still extended, and I called up the reserve command and I said, yeah, what's up, man? I still extended. They said, oh no, you're not extended anymore. You got let off almost as soon as you got put on there. So it's like, oh well, you didn't tell me. So, anyway, so I just wanted to say that good presentation. And also, you know, second what you're saying, I don't think that not only does the American military doesn't have really a whole lot of ideas about what's going to happen when the brown shirts take over in this, or try to take over in this country, but I feel like, you know, not only will a large portion of the military kind of switch, but there'll be a large portion of the military that stays, because, you know, a lot of leftists that I knew are veterans. Like, they come from the military, because you see, you know, in the military, you see what life could be like, you know, if you have that sort of, you know, not necessarily like a military society, but where you have like,
where you know,
we don't have to
where your overhead is taken care of, you know. I mean, that's, I think for a lot of us, that's it. Like my healthcare, my education, gym, I mean, all kind. You're telling me I need to be in shape. I need to work out every day. And you're providing me with a first-class gym to do so. That's the right way to do it. I shouldn't have to pay a $60 a month to join a gym if this is a requirement for what you want me to do. And they do. They provide that. You know, they also make you get up at 4:30 a.m. to work out, which
is the best preventative medicine in the world, in my opinion. You know, I mean, like staying healthy.
Yeah.
It lowers medical costs. You know, they say we want everybody to have a house. Well, they give you one.
Yeah.
They say we want everybody to have a job. Well, they give you a job. I mean, like this is the thing that I know veterans understand way better than someone who's never served, is that that we've seen what socialism can look like. We've seen one version of socialism in the military. We know that it's real. We've seen it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not imaginary for us.
Yeah, certainly we can criticize a lot of things about it, you know, but in its structure, in what it's intended to be, it is there. I mean, certainly, yeah, we could talk about, you know, the state of, say, the military hospitals during the Iraq War, you know, and the care the guys were not getting, you know, like, so the reality of it,
and still not getting,
right? But the idea, though, is you can see how, yeah, exactly, you have a structure that takes care, as I like to describe it, as people's overhead, right? And that you're able then to focus on what you need to be successful in your life, whether that's professionally, you know, with your family, with your whatever, you know.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
So right on. All right, man. I just wanted to say that, and I hope you have a good night. And I really appreciate you coming in and talking with us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for running, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Yeah. But anyway, I appreciate this very much. Thanks for having me here tonight, guys.
Oh yeah, thanks, Matt. And I really appreciate it. And if you ever have something you want to talk about, let us know. We can wrangle another one of these up whenever you feel like you need to get something out.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, you all have a good night.
Okay, have a good night, Matthew. Thank you so much.